The year 2026 began with a shock in Latin America, sending ripples of uncertainty across the continent and beyond. On January 3rd, the world awoke to news that the U.S. military had launched a swift and highly coordinated nighttime operation in Venezuela, targeting the removal of President Nicolas Maduro from power. The U.S. government quickly declared the mission a success, but for millions in the region, the announcement brought more questions than answers. Streets in Caracas, filled with anxious crowds, and across Latin America, people watched their screens in disbelief, trying to process what this meant for their future. The removal of a sitting president by foreign troops is a grave and controversial act, raising urgent questions about international law, national sovereignty, and the limits of foreign intervention. The world's legal and diplomatic communities scrambled to respond. For Venezuelans, the future suddenly seemed more uncertain than ever. For other Latin American countries, the operation served as a stark warning that no government was truly safe from outside interference. The U.S., under President Trump, signaled a bold and aggressive new approach in its own hemisphere, making it clear that it was willing to take dramatic action to shape the region's future. Images and videos from Caracas spread rapidly across social media, fueling heated debate worldwide. The world watched in real time as events unfolded, with hashtags and viral posts dominating the global conversation. Many world leaders, from Europe to Asia, condemned the U.S. action as reckless, dangerous, and deeply divisive. International organizations called for restraint and dialogue, but the damage to diplomatic relations was already done. The operation deepened rifts between the U.S. and its neighbors, straining alliances and likely shaping the region's politics for years to come. Political analysts warned of a new era of mistrust and instability. Attention quickly shifted to Cuba, Venezuela's longtime ally, and a nation with its own complicated history with the U.S. Many wondered if Havana would be the next target. U.S. official Marco Rubio issued a public warning to Cuba, escalating tensions even further and sending a clear message that the U.S. was not finished. His statement suggested that Cuba could be next, intensifying regional unease and leaving Cuban citizens and leaders on edge, bracing for possible confrontation. The future for Latin America now feels more uncertain than ever before. Families, governments, and entire communities are left wondering what tomorrow might bring. Governments across the region are urgently questioning U.S. intentions and reassessing their own security strategies, unsure of how to respond to this new reality. The entire region is bracing for what might come next, as uncertainty and fear grip the streets and leaders weigh their options. The U.S. has made it clear it's willing to use force to achieve its goals, and its military presence in the region is now impossible to ignore. Latin America is watching, wary of further upheaval, as the world holds its breath to see what the next chapter will bring. Marco Rubio, the current U.S. Secretary of State and a former senator from Florida, has long been a prominent figure in American politics. Known for his passionate speeches and strong opinions, Rubio has built his reputation as a fierce critic of Cuba's communist government and its allies in the region. After the U.S. government played a key role in ousting Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, Rubio appeared alongside President Trump at the White House. There, he delivered a pointed and unmistakable warning to the Cuban leadership, signaling a shift in U.S. foreign policy. Rubio stated, "If I lived in Havana and I was in the government, I'd be concerned at least a little bit." His words were carefully chosen, but the underlying message was clear. The U.S. was willing to take bold action. The message was unmistakable. Cuba could face the same fate as Venezuela if it continued to defy U.S. demands. This was not just a warning, but a direct challenge to the Cuban government's authority. Rubio's history of opposing the leadership in both Cuba and Venezuela is well known. He has consistently advocated for tougher U.S. policies, arguing that only strong action can bring about real change. He believes the U.S. should actively promote democracy throughout Latin America, even if that means using military force or economic pressure. For Rubio, the stakes are not just political, they are deeply personal, rooted in his own family's Cuban heritage. His statement was seen around the world as a possible threat of future military action. International media quickly picked up on Rubio's remarks, sparking concern among global leaders and analysts. For Cuba, Rubio's words were a direct challenge to its sovereignty. For others, they ignited a heated debate about the risks and consequences of U.S. intervention in the region. Some Americans supported Rubio's tough stance, believing it was time for the U.S. to take a harder line. Others, however, worried that such rhetoric could lead to unnecessary conflict and instability. The warning set the stage for a tense new era in U.S.-Cuba relations, with both sides bracing for what might come next. The diplomatic landscape was suddenly more volatile than it had been in years. The world is now watching closely to see if the U.S. will act on Rubio's words, or if cooler heads will prevail. Every move is being scrutinized by international observers and the media. The stakes for Cuba, and for the entire region, have never been higher, as uncertainty and tension continue to grow on both sides of the Florida Straits. The U.S. military's operation in Venezuela was massive and meticulously planned. Months of intelligence gathering, surveillance, and coordination between multiple branches of the armed forces set the stage for what would become one of the most daring interventions in recent history. Every detail was scrutinized, from the timing of the assault to the routes the troops would take through the city. Overnight, elite forces entered Caracas under the cover of darkness, moving swiftly and silently through the city's labyrinthine streets. Their primary objective, to capture President Maduro and his wife before dawn, minimizing the risk of resistance or civilian casualties. Over 150 U.S. aircraft launched from across the hemisphere, filling the night sky with the thunder of engines and the precision of coordinated flight. The sheer scale of the air operation demonstrated overwhelming power and left little doubt about American resolve. Months of preparation and rehearsals went into ensuring the mission's success. Soldiers trained for every possible scenario, running drills in mock urban environments to simulate the challenges they would face in Caracas. The Trump administration framed the action as a show of American strength, emphasizing the need to restore order and protect U.S. interests in the region. Officials spoke of decisive leadership and the importance of sending a clear message to adversaries. The U.S. saw Maduro as a destabilizing force, blaming him for Venezuela's economic collapse and political turmoil. Determined to reassert dominance in the region, the U.S. sought to reshape the balance of power in Latin America and reaffirm its influence. For Caracas residents, the sudden military incursion was terrifying. Many awoke to the sounds of helicopters and gunfire, unsure of what the morning would bring or how their lives would change. The operation left Venezuela with a power vacuum and deep uncertainty. Government buildings stood empty, and the streets were eerily quiet as people waited for news of what would come next. The world saw the reach of U.S. military might, as headlines flashed across global news networks and leaders around the world reacted with shock and concern, but also questioned the violation of sovereignty. Protests erupted in several countries, with critics warning of the dangers of foreign intervention. The long-term impact on Venezuelan society remains unknown. Families faced an uncertain future, unsure if stability or further chaos would follow. The U.S. sent a clear message, willing to use force to shape the region's future, regardless of international criticism or local fears. The consequences for Venezuela and beyond are just beginning to unfold, leaving the world to wonder what the next chapter will bring. Cuba is deeply alarmed by the U.S. action in Venezuela. Venezuela was Cuba's main ally, providing cheap oil and vital support. With Maduro gone, Cuba faces an immediate energy crisis and economic hardship. The loss of Venezuelan oil threatens electricity, transportation, and daily life on the island. Politically, the U.S. operation signals a willingness to use force against unfriendly governments. Cuba, long at odds with the U.S., now feels isolated and vulnerable. The warning from Marco Rubio revived old fears of American intervention. Havana's leaders are left wondering if they're next. The collapse of regional alliances leaves Cuba exposed. The government must now confront both economic disaster and the threat of U.S. action. Cuba hasn't faced this level of anxiety in decades. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel responded with fury to the U.S. operation and Rubio's warning. At a massive rally in Havana, he condemned the U.S. attack as cowardly and criminal. Díaz-Canel demanded proof that Maduro was alive and accused the U.S. of lying about its motives. He claimed the real goal was to seize Venezuela's oil, not fight drugs. The Cuban president called the operation state terrorism. He declared that Latin America is not the U.S.'s backyard, demanding respect for regional independence. The speech was meant to rally Cubans and show defiance. Díaz-Canel promised Cuba would not be intimidated or submit to U.S. pressure. His words turned political tension into a public stand against the U.S. Cuba's leadership is preparing for difficult times ahead. The U.S. action in Venezuela and threats to Cuba sparked strong reactions across Latin America. Colombia, sharing a border with Venezuela, was singled out by President Trump, who warned its leader to watch his ass. Colombia's President Gustavo Petro condemned the U.S. operation as an assault on regional sovereignty. He warned of a potential humanitarian crisis and mass migration from Venezuela. Left-leaning governments like Cuba and Colombia see the U.S. move as imperialist and dangerous. They call for unity against American intervention. Some countries quietly support the U.S., but even they worry about the precedent set by military force. The region is now divided and unstable, with diplomacy growing more complicated. The fear of further U.S. intervention hangs over every government. Latin America faces a new era of uncertainty. History explains why Latin America is so wary of U.S. intervention. The U.S. has a long record of meddling in the region, from the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba to coups in Chile and Guatemala. These actions, often justified as promoting democracy, left deep scars and mistrust. The recent operation in Venezuela revives old fears of American control. Many in Latin America see this as just another chapter in a long story of interference. Memories of past violence and instability shape today's anxieties. The region fears a return to an era of U.S. interventionism. The crisis goes beyond Venezuela and Cuba. It threatens the principle of sovereignty for all Latin America. U.S. military intervention makes every country feel vulnerable. The risk of humanitarian disaster is real, with millions potentially displaced. Neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil could be overwhelmed by refugees. The region may be forced into a new Cold War, divided between supporting or opposing the U.S. Years of regional cooperation could unravel, replaced by mistrust and conflict. Ordinary people face fear, economic hardship, and uncertainty about the future. Governments distracted by crisis have less capacity to help their citizens. The dream of a peaceful, united Latin America is at risk. The entire continent is affected by these events. As of January 4, 2026, the Americas are on edge. The U.S. has shown it's willing to use force, and Cuba is bracing for possible action. Other nations, like Colombia, have voiced strong opposition. The world is watching a tense political standoff unfold. Venezuela faces a power vacuum and possible civil conflict. Cuba is preparing for the worst, possibly seeking help from Russia or China. The Trump administration's aggressive policy has upended regional politics. Everyone is waiting, hoping for peace, but fearing more conflict.